Political discourse can often be a difficult conversation to have. In the United States, dishonest and uninformed Americans will speak absolute lies and bullshit with unshaken confidence. This path of ignorance is destroying our nation and any opportunity for all our people to prosper. The United States is a constitutional republic that democratically elects the representatives. This is a fact for now, and hopefully remains true during the 2026 and 28 elections. If it does, then the Democratic Party will need a message if it wants to defeat Trump and Republicans. The question then becomes, what is that message? What is the political agenda of the Democratic Party? Their current approval rating is 29%, as per this latest CNN poll. So the answer of no, everything is fine, we don't need to change anything, it's bullshit. It's an unacceptable answer. We as Americans must demand more from our politicians. We must unify on what that message is, a message clear and concise that we can easily inform other Americans to gain support for those policies. Without elected officials to pass that legislation, public support means little to our bought and corrupt politicians. Medicare for All is a great example for this. Over the past 12 years, polling has hovered around 65-70%, depending on the poll and the wording they use. Usually, those polls even show a plurality of Republican voters that support Medicare for All. However, in Congress, they continue to block legislation that improves American healthcare. For those in Congress that continue to block that legislation, they must be replaced. Before discussing the political policies themselves, however, we need to first establish a foundation. What framework has the Democratic Party been using, and what should it be changed to moving forward? This foundation will help us to compare the political lenses in which our fellow citizens see things and provide a visual to the American political landscape. Our elected politicians, and the empty headed bobbleheads in the mainstream media, would want you to believe that our nation is just closely divided, a 50-50 split between Democrats and Republicans, left wing and right wing. This isn't exactly true. This country and our people are far more complex than that, with more existing political parties and political ideologies in this country than there is time for me to explain in one video. However, I have it narrowed down to 8 political ideologies and groups of thought to explain American politics for those not familiar or those who normally don't have time to learn and follow politics in more detail. After going through these political lenses, I will then discuss why social democracy is the best of the 8 of these to reduce economic hardship on our people and in the quickest time frame. To provide this foundation, I will be borrowing the political spectrum here from the Encyclopedia Britannica. This spectrum visually shows the ideologies going from a moderate center to the political extremes on the left and right. We often hear the terms conservative, moderate, and liberal, but so rarely do we then hear accurate beliefs or descriptions of these ideologies. In American discourse, conservative and liberal are often used when discussing the Republican and Democratic parties, respectively. While our two-party election system does make that typically the case during general elections, it is thus the primary election that is far more important. For Americans to improve our lives democratically, we need to elect politicians that will fight for positive economic changes. By having them run in the Democratic Party, it is far easier than running as an independent, although not impossible. For those who want to support a strong Democratic Party, then in many closed primary states, you need to be registered with that party to vote. Closed primaries suppress voting turnout, and the federal primary process should be reformed. Regardless of party, which, while that does upset some liberal and corporatist Democrats, but as an American who believes in country over party, I don't care. So, regardless of the party, the message and political goals of the politicians is what matters more. So, what is the message and what is the coalition needed to bring that message to reality. Before going into details of the left-wing coalition, we will start with the right-wing coalition. We will start with the furthest right on the spectrum and work our way left. So with that, the furthest right position, which also just happens to be the current ideology of the US president and where our nation is headed if there continues to be limited to no pushback. The furthest right on this spectrum is fascism. It is commonly known as a far-right authoritarian political ideology. All power is concentrated into the executive branch of government, with focus on militarism, ultranationalism, strong corporate ties, and suppression of dissent and opposition. The leader will centralize authority, going against the previous democratic norms. During this transition and throughout the fascist reign, human rights abuses increased substantially. We are seeing these very actions take place in the US right now under Trump. The political lens of fascism is diametrically opposed to our principles as a constitutional republic with democratically elected representatives. I could just say democracy, but then every conservative dipshit out there just enjoys correcting you, saying, we're not a democracy, it's a constitutional republic. Yeah. Not like they care about the Constitution, as they support Trump, who defies it daily, making a mockery of the rule of law. Trump's actions in these 4 short months, only 4 months, since taking office, have been filled with fascist actions and impeachable offenses. To anyone who would argue otherwise, either you are not paying attention or you support these actions. Those supporting his administration will lie, gaslight, and obfuscate the truth. Although, to be fair, it's not unique to them, so did the previous administration. With regards to Biden's health and Israel's ongoing genocide against Palestinians, those are critical reasons why the Democratic Party has an image problem that it must reconcile with to regain the trust of voters. But more on that later. Focusing back on Trump and his fascist regime, he has committed crimes that Congress could argue are impeachable offenses, and upon official charges of impeachment, the Senate, through their trial, can determine if the evidence presented is sufficient to remove him from office. If they don't want to go that route, they could also invoke the 25th Amendment, stating Trump's age and mental decline are a security threat to this nation, which they are, and remove him under that process. In either method, they could cite Trump's schizophrenic tariff policy. That alone could be used to argue either case, not to mention the rampant corruption, withholding money appropriated by Congress, disregarding court orders, and the overall fact he is a domestic threat to our country. Unfortunately, our Congress in its current form is spineless. Don't hold your breath on Trump leaving office before the midterms. Depending on how those go, it could become a different conversation. But if Trump does leave office for any reason, J.D. Vance is the vice president, and it's unlikely things improve much from there. Regardless, for all those who are in this fight to actually make this nation better, we need a unifying message to replace the one of hatred and ignorance from the MAGA movement. Through education and understanding our political and economic systems in the United States, we can improve them. To discuss and advance our own political objectives, we also must understand the goals of other political lenses. So now let's move on to conservatism. Conservatives, in terms of those who are elected in office, are a dwindling number. As each Republican and the several Democrats who allow Trump's consolidation of power in the executive branch and his illegal activities, their complicity in fascism makes them fascists themselves. For the actual conservative voters out there, you may describe yourselves as someone who values social traditions and opposed to change. Sometimes those traits are rooted from religious beliefs, but not always. It is common, though, that the more religious a person is, they are often more conservative in their political beliefs. For those that take religion to extremes, though, people who are religious fundamentalists, which in the United States, it is the Christian nationalists to be concerned with. They are a subset of fascists, with a focus of reshaping the cultural life of this country in line with their religious views. Since they are a group that has supported Trump, he has rewarded several Christian nationalists to positions of power in his administration. Examples: Mike Huckabee as the ambassador to Israel, and Pete Hegseth as the Secretary of Defense. Any form of supremacy, whether it is based on religious lines, racial lines, or national lines, once that is mixed in with political ideology and they gain power, human rights violations become inevitable, and why they must be removed from power as quickly as possible. Refocusing back on conservatives and their other political traits, specifically their political ambitions over the past 50 years or so. They have pushed for less government regulation in support of free market capitalism. The Reagan ideas of trickle-down economics and pulling oneself up by their own bootstraps. In other words, they believe if government does not intervene in the market and they lower tax rates for businesses, more jobs will be created, more money will go to workers. They don't want people to be handed money. They believe it makes them lazy. Money must be earned in exchange for labor. With the money earned from hard work, those that do this should be successful in our society. Some of you, particularly those working 40 plus hours each week in shitty dead end jobs, will already know the answer here. Has the Reagan idea of economics made us rich? Has the tax cuts from Bush and Trump's first term helped us afford our economic needs? Has wealth trickled down? No. This bullshit does not work. Any worker making less than $75,000 a year, which is about half of all U.S. income earners, they will tell you this has not worked. And even those making $100,000 to $150,000, if they have families of four, they're also still struggling. Even households with multiple incomes. Paying bills can be difficult with rising costs and unexpected expenses. Anyone who still believes this works is either uninformed or some rich asshole gaslighting you, so we don't change the system that keeps those robber baron leeches wealthy. We have had several conservative leaders since Reagan, and none of those administrations passed legislative agendas that have improved the lives of Americans. This is not to say conservative leaders couldn't be successful or do good things. Such examples of good Republican presidents in the past include Dwight Eisenhower for signing into law the 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act that created the modern highway systems in the U.S., Theodore Roosevelt in 1906 passing what was called the Antiquities Act, and it established the start of the U.S. National Park System. Obviously, there's Abraham Lincoln, the Republican who saved the Union in the Civil War and ended slavery. Even Richard Nixon deserves an honorable mention for establishing the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970. Conservatives used to do some good things. Maybe when they are done with this fascism phase of theirs, they can return to being a patriot and help our people again. With that said, let's move on to libertarianism. The libertarian ideology is a little more difficult to discuss. This is because, in the libertarian lens, there are several subgroups that could place libertarians in several places on the spectrum on both wings. They can be to the right of conservatives, as far right up next to fascism, such as those who believe in anarcho-capitalism. This is a version of libertarianism that radically reduces or entirely eliminates the social safety net and a majority of regulations on businesses. Javier Milei is an example of this, who is the president of Argentina. He is a believer in this philosophy, and who Donald Trump looks to for inspiration as he cuts our social safety net and business regulations here in the US. There is another subgroup called libertarian socialists. This is a group that, despite calling themselves libertarians, their beliefs are more closely in line with communism. They are anti-authoritarian and anti-capitalist, and would therefore be placed on the left wing past the capitalist dividing line. When describing political ideologies, there is another visual called the political compass, which works by adding the additional axis representing the libertarian and authoritarian designations. The political compass can be more useful when doing more in-depth study on a political ideology. But for this video, I wanted to keep it simpler and why I chose the political spectrum. Going back to that and finishing with the libertarians, the common traits and what are usually the focus of the US political party libertarians are the ideas of individual and market liberty. Any legislation that restricts personal choice or tries to regulate free market capitalism, libertarians will commonly be opposed to such measures. They fight for smaller governments, as they believe larger governments, by definition, will mean infringement on the rights of individuals and the free market. They assume the market has the ability to self regulate itself. Many of us know that's not true and why we need government regulations, but we'll put a pin in that for now and we'll come back to that later. As you may have noticed, there is some commonality between libertarians and conservatives when it relates to limiting government power in the interest of capitalism. It is for this reason that many libertarians do end up voting for Republicans in general elections. That is why I have them grouped together as part of the right wing coalition, and why sometimes in political discourse, their terms and ideologies get used in place of each other, even though that's not always correct. The final group in the right wing coalition, before we move on to the left wing, are the centrists. Now, centrism, by definition, is having moderate political beliefs that are between liberal and conservative. If you are saying to yourself, well, that doesn't really mean anything, you are absolutely correct. Centrism tangibly doesn't mean a goddamn thing. Centrists are politicians who have no real beliefs and will vote in ways considered popular at the time or vote in alignment with whomever gives them more campaign contributions. In recent history, there are two centrist politicians that come to mind for their part in weakening Joe Biden's Build Back Better legislation. They are Joe Manchin, Senator from West Virginia, and Kristen Sinema, Senator from Arizona. Early in the Joe Biden administration, legislation was discussed called the Build Back Better Act. Original provisions in the bill included increasing the minimum wage, extending the child tax credit, paid family and medical leave, and several other good provisions. It is because of the actions of Senators Manchin and Sinema that this bill failed in the Senate. In the name of centrism and moderates, they killed this bill that would have tangibly helped improve the lives of millions of Americans. Yes, the bill that came after that, the Inflation Reduction Act, did some good things, but it was a significantly weaker bill. It is because of legislative failures like this, when any Democrat says they are a centrist or a blue dog Democrat, or that we need to work across the aisle, bullshit. Any more politicians that state they support the center have no vision, no political convictions to make this country better. There is no need for those types in Congress at this time. For the types of congressional leaders we do need in this country, it is time to discuss the left wing. Starting with liberalism, it is a political lens in which they, like libertarians, support individual freedoms, but the methods in which that is done is what makes them different. Liberals will sometimes use the tools in government they have to protect the rights of our citizens from the overreach and predatory practices of corporations or those who commit fraud. As mentioned, libertarians are opposed to government regulation in most cases, and of course it does depend on which type of libertarian you're talking with. There are good and meaningful business regulations. One example of such regulations are those prohibiting companies from polluting our air and our water. Let's discuss the need for government regulations a little more. The libertarian or conservative response against government regulation is if a company does wrong by society, then the society will just stop supporting them. They'll stop spending their money at those places of business. It's a nice thought, and boycotts, when done correctly, can be effective. But this line of argument misses two important points. Under their no regulation ideology, even if the company does go out of business after the backlash of what they've done, the damage is still already done. The water is polluted, or the air is polluted, or they created a product that's unsafe. Damage is done. Local communities, and in the case of environmental catastrophes, the wildlife that lived there, those areas are now destroyed. They are poisoned. And the second problem is now, with the damage that's been caused, if there are no laws in place, there is now no legal mechanism to bring charges against those responsible and put them through due process in our justice system. In these cases where large companies cause damage, if there are no actual consequences, or the price to settle in court is so low that it just becomes a budget line item in their cost of business, then this will never change the behavior of companies as they pursue larger profits. This is a weakness of libertarian thinking, and where liberalism occasionally has done some good things for our people. However, as a social democrat, my critique is that liberalism does not protect citizens enough from capitalism. Now, of course, those on my left, the socialists, will then turn to me and say that social democracy doesn't protect citizens enough. Which, yes, that is fair, and we will go into more detail on that. But before diving into the differences of social democracy, which is my view, and the views of democratic socialists, one last thing about liberalism, and then we will talk briefly about communism. The final point of liberalism is their last characteristic of support for free market capitalism. This is a trait that we've now seen shared by libertarians, conservatives, and centrists. The United States defines itself by its capitalist economy, and for decades these groups were the majority in the Overton window. The term Overton window meaning the acceptable range of topics in political discussions. Now that window has shifted so far right that fascists aren't just on our doorstep. They are here. They are in the house, and they are making our lives worse because of it. Capitalism has failed the people of the United States, and the people must demand better. So, is communism better? Now, what communism is, it's a stateless, classless society. No one owns property. All people are treated equal. There is no political state. To describe it further from my understanding, basically humans are divided into stateless communes. Goods and services are distributed to those who need them when they are needed. It sounds nice, and while on smaller scales they theoretically could exist, my problem with communism is it just isn't practical at this time. There are currently 0 functioning communist societies out of the 195 nations that currently exist. Those on the right will claim China, Russia, North Korea, that they are communist societies. Nope. False. They all have capitalist economies as their method of distributing goods. What varies between them is their socialist component, meaning how much government involvement is in their economic decision making, and their authoritarian component. Now, if you describe them all as authoritarian nations, absolute true fact, but also so is increasingly the United States. Now, maybe the communists out there don't like how I described communism, or for that matter, if anyone out there feels I misrepresented your political ideology, leave a comment below. Let me know what I got wrong. Understand, though, these lenses aren't the focus of this video, but are here to provide a frame of reference as we move on to the final political lenses, and what I propose should be the next policy platform of either the Democratic Party, if they want to win seats and legislate solutions, or the policy platform for the next coalition of political independents in the US Congress. So long as the end result is the same, the political party is secondary. Either Democrats can embrace social democracy or get out of the way. Now, that socialist component, the idea of how much government involvement is in the economic processes of a nation, can help define where a socialist subgroup lies on this political spectrum. For the final 2 political lenses, democratic socialism and social democracy, these are the 2 groups needed to have political discussions to move our Overton window back to the left. By doing this and educating our people, we can then fight for policies that improve the lives of everyone. Back in 2016 and a little bit in 2020, you may have heard these 2 political lenses more commonly enter the vernacular of political discussion. Bernie Sanders, back in 2016 in his first run for president, would define himself as a democratic socialist, and it has been a headache ever since. What I mean by that, he's using the wrong political term. He's fighting for the right policies, but he's describing them with the wrong term. To further expand on this point, I will use a clip from the YouTube channel Secular Talk, hosted by Kyle Kalinske. In this clip from his show back in July of 2018, there was an MSNBC segment that, like Bernie Sanders, incorrectly describes these two ideologies. Let's watch and then we'll discuss in more detail.
Bernie Sanders describes his democratic socialism in a similar way as MSNBC just defined it. Now, here's the problem. If you want to be really technical and really literal here, they're wrong. Bernie Sanders is wrong. Again, MSNBC just described it this way. I heard on TYT they described it this way, among many other places. They're describing it in a way that if you go to the textbook definitions, they are just factually incorrect. So democratic socialism in reality actually is post-capitalist. It's a post-capitalism philosophy. So in other words, it doesn't coexist with capitalism. It's not a mixed market economy. It is post-capitalist. So what that means is social ownership of the means of production. But what you see here is they're not describing that. They're not describing a post-capitalist philosophy. They're describing a system that coincides with capitalism. So what they're defining, and when I say they, I mean MSNBC in this clip, Bernie Sanders, and many others, what they're really describing is social democracy. So social democracy is a heavily regulated version of capitalism. It's a mixed market economy, and it has strong socialist aspects in there.
Now, Kyle is absolutely correct here. Democratic socialism is post-capitalist, whereas social democracy is the final left position within a capitalist framework. Democratic socialist nations have economies that are planned economies, which means all products produced and schedules are assigned from a government branch or department. The most extreme version of this would be North Korea, where they have state ownership over all production in the country. China would then probably be a close second, but as they have embraced more capitalist ideals, their economy is now more mixed than planned. I am not any form of socialist or a democratic socialist. I do not believe in a post-capitalist ideology. I do not believe it is necessary for the state to have full control over all planning in the economy. I think it is a waste of their time and resources to spend time on deciding how many of certain goods should be produced and arguments along that line. Now, those who do believe in democratic socialism, such as the 92,000 and growing members of the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, with members in all 50 states, they would argue that due to the predatory behavior of capitalism and profit-driven motives, it must be replaced by an economic system that isn't profit-based. Maybe they are correct, and I hear their ideas and don't dismiss them. What I am most uncertain of, when it is time for a general election, will the average, less politically informed American support a democratic socialist message? The argument of democratizing the workplace is a goal that I support. I would go about it in a different way than DSA members probably would, but that is their policy to focus on and explain to the American people. What I am saying to those on my left flank is my disagreements with you are not on the merits of your arguments, but a disagreement on strategy. As a social democrat, I don't believe the voters are there yet. Americans like their capitalist identity, but clearly unregulated capitalism cannot continue. To protect all our people in the quickest time frame, social democracy is the political lens, and social security for all is the message to rally around to defeat fascism and improve lives in the next elections. One last point before moving on to what the social democratic policies we need to fight for are. I have a clip here from David Pakman. It was posted back in January of 2020. He will also state the difference between these political lenses, but then also describe social democracy in the perfect way to lead us into the next segment.
Any opportunity to clear this up is a good one. This is not about my interpretation of democratic socialist versus social democrat. The difference is democratic socialists are socialists and social democrats are not. Social democrats, I know that a lot of them don't like to use this term. Social democrats are capitalists who want a very well regulated version of capitalism that takes the wealth created by the capitalist system disproportionately for the rich and reallocates it to social programs and government spending to ensure that no one has a standard of living that goes too low.
As David states, social democrats are capitalists. I know many who identify to the left of liberal don't want to highlight capitalism, or those further to the left don't support capitalism as an economic choice. The problem is we have to acknowledge the rest of the American electorate. Liberals, centrists, libertarians, and conservatives all see themselves as supporters of a free market, despite varying details on how that market should be regulated. We have experienced leadership under liberals to conservatives for the past 60 or so years, and its failure has led us to fascism. So, what does an American society look like that prioritizes human rights and economic rights of its people? The current system we understand is inadequate, but how many of us know how to articulate that point in a meaningful way? How many of us understand how poverty, for example, is defined and calculated in the United States? The top left here is information from the website usafacts.org and describes the history of the nation's poverty line. In 1963, a statistician working for the Social Security Administration, Molly Orshansky, developed what we refer to as the poverty line. Before working in the Social Security Administration, she was an economist in the Department of Agriculture, the USDA. She created this poverty line based on the cost of a no frills food plan for a family of four. Using this calculation, she would determine an amount of money a family would need for this food plan and additional living expenses. She used this model to create 124 poverty thresholds, accounting for various family dynamics. I think the quantity is a bit over the top, but I believe her heart was in the right place. By creating this metric, we could then identify who is in need of help, although the methodology should definitely be changed. The additional information on this screen is from the Social Security Bulletin, Volume 55, Number 4, from winter of 1992. It goes over some of the data and how the threshold has been adjusted from 1963 to 1991. So, how is it calculated today? The calculation of it is relatively unchanged. The metric is under the responsibility of the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation, the ASPE. The ASPE advises the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, so unfortunately that's currently RFK Jr., who is then advised on health policy, disability, and human services information and other data collected by this group. It is a safe bet to assume by now these government offices probably have less employees collecting and studying the data right now. Prior to the firings and closings of government employees and offices under Trump, the data that was collected prior is used to calculate modern day poverty lines that are shown on their website. Now, I've had many conversations with friends or coworkers about the poverty line. Not necessarily this in depth, but rather the conversation would go something like this, usually around healthcare. I have a job that does not provide a healthcare plan. They don't give me enough hours to qualify for a healthcare plan. I then look to go purchase my own healthcare plan, but it costs too much. I then look at the government marketplace plans, and they're also still too expensive. If I try to apply to Medicaid, which is supposedly the plan for the poorest Americans, I then get told I make too much money. For anyone who ever applied to Medicaid or other government programs but was denied enrollment because their income was considered too high, This poverty line is one of the metrics used, if not the only metric, that's being compared against your income. Now, the poverty lines in 2025, if you are on your own, you have to be making less than $15,650 to be considered in poverty. So, for example, if you're someone that maybe works part time, makes $25,000 a year, if you live alone, you wouldn't be able to apply for Medicaid. You are above the poverty threshold. And hilariously, if you feel you're struggling with that $25,000, the government here says, well, you should be actually able to at least take care of 2 to 3 people with that amount of money. For 3 people, it's $26,650. Is as long as you're above that line, they don't consider you're in poverty. These metrics are absolutely inadequate. And then for some reason, Hawaii and Alaska, they'll acknowledge that you actually need a little bit more money to not be considered in poverty. Why they're different makes no sense. I can only assume it's for reasons of which I don't know, and that's as far as I care to dig into these self evident, vastly inadequate poverty metrics. Another inadequate government understanding in our system is the income tax brackets. These are the tax brackets for 2024. Taxes are a subject deserving of its own video. I bring up this information to have as reference for the next slide coming up. Although a few quick notes here about our income tax system. The final tax bracket is 37% of all income over $609,350 for single filers. We know income inequality is at extremes in this country. Adding some additional brackets will be necessary to help address that. With additional revenue, what would that money be put towards? With so many Americans living in poverty, we need to look at how to reduce that economic stress on our people. Thinking back to the poverty line, instead of using food costs as the defining variable for calculating the poverty line, what criteria would make a more useful poverty metric going forward? One important objective for social democrats and leftists in general is ensuring that all people have a form of permanent housing. No person should be homeless. Housing is a human right. If there is homelessness, it is a political failing of that nation. There are two main components to address housing. The first is universal through all political lenses, which is the quantity of homes. As our population increases, we also need to increase the available amount of homes and apartment buildings. How they are built and who owns them is what's up for debate between the ideologies. But the fact remains we still need to build more homes. The second component is how do we make sure our society can afford housing? There are two ways to look at that from a left wing lens. The first is raising wages to guarantee everyone who works 40 hours a week can afford a permanent place to live for themselves and their family. The second is legislation that implements rent control, limits on how expensive certain properties can be. Americans are not ready for socialized housing. But the next group of politicians must pass legislation raising the minimum wage at the very least. It is preferable that they raise the wage and limit the price of various apartments and other housing out there. As for homeowners, we also need legislation to stop banks and other large money financial interests from buying homes to then only rent them out to people for prices far higher than what they would be paying for a mortgage directly for that home, or allowing them to leave those homes empty to raise their value artificially by shorting the supply. Two more notes here on this chart before moving on to the next segment. The current hourly minimum wage in this country is still $7.25 an hour. If you work full time, which is defined in this country as 40 hours a week and with 52 weeks in a year, the gross income at the minimum wage is around $15,000. After taxes, using those rates from 2024, it goes down to about $13,500. Now, the actual amount will still vary person to person. Did they have additional tax credits? Are they married? Stuff like that. But even at the full amount of $15,080, that income is vastly insufficient to afford any sort of home or even a one bedroom apartment at $800 a month. And there is no guarantee anymore that you will ever find a one bedroom apartment for $800 a month or for the yearly amount of $9,600. Now, raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour alone doesn't solve the problem, but it would lessen the financial pain. At least with $15 an hour, you might be able to find a cheap apartment that you can rent. Of course, for those with families, it's still not going to be enough. You're not going to be able to find a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment with an income of $15 an hour. And as our administration wants more people to have families, how the hell are they supposed to do that? When all of their income is going to their housing, how can they afford anything else? If you were to look at the income of someone making $104,000 a year, or the equivalent of $50 an hour, it is only then you are somewhat comfortable to afford housing up to the cost of $2,000 a month or $24,000 a year. Now, even at the top end of this chart here, for something that's $3,000 a month or $36,000 a year, for someone making $104,000 before taxes, it is about 41.8% of their net income going to housing. If they want that fancier apartment, they might be able to make it work. But for everyone else who is making less, which again is about 60% or more of income earners in this country, your living options are limited, or you have to live with roommates as a necessity just to survive. Now, one additional row of importance here is the bottom one. That shows the richest among us making incomes of $1 million or more per year. Now, for those making $1 million in hourly terms, that's about $500 an hour. Do you really think anyone's labor is actually worth $500 per hour? I really don't think so. But if we're going to allow people to do it, the taxes need to be increased on it. Because as we can see, as compared to housing costs, they are able to afford whatever they want. Of course, these income earners are doing it through salary or other forms of contracts or financial investments, meaning their money makes them more money. I am not against people being successful in acquiring wealth to improve their lives and the ones around them. However, it becomes a problem when our failed economic and tax systems, which allow them to accumulate wealth, is now at the expense of the well-being of the rest of the people in our country. For those that argue, no, we can't tax the rich more, bullshit. They were taxed at higher rates before, and we must do it again. To put it in terms with housing, as we have discussed, for those making $1 million after tax is about $627,000 if they pay their full 37% rate, which they're not. Well, let's just pretend they are. So even at $627,000, if they get the most expensive option on this chart, an apartment, again, $3,000 a month or $36,000 per year, it's only 5.7% of their net income. There are millions struggling financially in this country, many of them homeless. The rich can pay more in taxes to address the economic failures of previous administrations. For a capitalist system to work, there must be enough money in circulation, constantly moving between three main groups. The groups are citizens, businesses, and government. The citizen group also has the labels of workers and consumers, for that is how we interact as we either work for those companies or purchase their goods and services from them. We as citizens can also purchase services from the government, such as mailing things at the post office. When you work for either the government or a private company, they are purchasing your labor. These arrows represent money moving from one group to another, and why the purchase arrows go back and forth between all three groups. As work is done and purchases are made, these transactions are taxed in order to fund projects designated by government officials. So many in the United States view taxes as a bad thing, and that they should be lowered to incentivize growth. The truth is, without proper taxes to fund necessary programs and investments in this country, it puts the well-being of our people and the national security of this nation at risk. Moving the United States to a social democratic model means informing Americans that we need to raise taxes on the wealthiest to pay for universal social programs. By doing this, we move our current system of vast wealth inequality to a model more like on screen. If this image was changed to represent our current capitalist model, the UBI would be gone and it'd just be a very thin benefits arrow that representing Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP programs, the very limited social safety net we have right now. By denying money to the people who need it most, it creates economic instability. As our nation's people struggle to afford homes and paying other bills, how are they meant to focus on their jobs? When humans are stressed, they don't sleep well, their productivity decreases, and mistakes and errors increase dramatically. It is for those reasons why the welfare of our people must be the responsibility of Congress. Our Constitution already states in Article 1, Section 8 that Congress has the power to lay and collect taxes for the common defense and general welfare of the U.S. Those opposed to social programs will argue they are not included in this article. Nonsense. As stated, if our people are facing economic instability, the nation as a whole is unstable. To bring economic stability, universal basic income and other social democratic policies are the start. The failed ideologies of conservatism, liberalism, and all in between have not worked, resulting in a broken healthcare system, no money to afford rent, or live life in any meaningful way. These ideologies fail because they either naively believe business interests would do what is right for our people, or look the other way when they don't because they were paid to. I have a clip here from a recent Daily Show episode hosted by Jon Stewart. This was during a discussion about DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, back in February 2025. He makes an important point about corporations that I want to share and discuss before moving on to the final topic for this video.
We live in the upside down, and don't blame the corporations. They are profit-seeking psychopaths that need the lowest wages and the cheapest raw materials to drive their highest profits. But why do we, the taxpayers, subsidize their psychopathy? That's the waste, fraud, and abuse in our system. That's it.
Jon is absolutely correct here. For us to not be surprised that corporations will stop at nothing to make a line on a chart go up. The current waste and fraud in our system is the legalized bribery from political donations. In a system with higher taxes and higher minimum wages, companies would not have the disposable income to waste on stock buybacks and bribing politicians, and that's how it should be. Americans must demand the wealth they created be returned back to the people. The best method to do this is through a universal basic income to help subsidize incomes for every citizen, and the implementation of a single-payer Medicare for All healthcare plan for every person in the country. My first video describes legislation to do just that, called the Social Security for All Act. To remove the economic insecurity from our people, these 5 pillars will address the healthcare and economic crisis in the United States. Would my bill eliminate all poverty and homelessness? I would hope so, but it's not guaranteed. What I could say with certainty is that those numbers would be greatly reduced. Additional legislation will be needed to fix the various problems in our nation. After addressing healthcare and the economy, what would be next? What other positive changes can be made with a government using a social democratic lens? For a better country, there has to be agreement that certain services must not be allowed to be run for profit, and that they should not have a cost for the service or price be low enough so as it is not a barrier to the service. With little to no regulations, profit motives will corrupt the industries and result in worse outcomes for those who rely on it, all in the pursuit of profit. For example, let's take the first industry listed on this list, which is healthcare, something I have mentioned a couple of times throughout this episode. The main function of healthcare is that those who need medical care should receive it. The US must join other developed nations and guarantee healthcare as a human right. Currently, it is not treated that way. It is a product for profit. When healthcare is delayed and sometimes denied due to the greed and complexity of our for profit, multi payer system, people die. Without going on about it much longer right now, as this will be the focus of my next episode, if you remove the profit motive from our healthcare system, patients will see better health outcomes. Medical providers could focus solely on care instead of wasting time with insurance companies arguing for payment and to proceed with medical procedures. Each of these services listed are, in my view, what social democrats, and ideally the Democratic Party, should be arguing to be services publicly funded. What the frame of discussion can then be is how much government involvement is required to guarantee Americans are getting the best service for the cheapest price for their tax dollars. Does the government simply fund the service? Or are the employees that provide the service government employees, or is it contracted out to private workers? One example of this, going back to healthcare, is we could have a single payer system, but a mixed provider market, meaning some of the doctors would stay as private practice. They decide their own salaries, they decide when they work, or they could be government employees, either at the federal level or the state level. Regardless of the services that they provide, it would all be funded for by taxpayer dollars. Now, the alternative to that would be think of the National Health Service in Great Britain, the NHS. It is a publicly funded health service with public providers. Once again, meaning that it is publicly funded and the workers are government employees. If there are enough votes in Congress to make that happen, sure, I'm not going to get in the way, but I believe the easier path to victory here and the quicker path to implementing is a Medicare for All system that is publicly funded with a mix of public and private providers. So long as the medical providers are licensed and all humans in the United States receive healthcare when they need it without financial ruin, then great. We have fixed the main problems. Whether they are public or private providers is up to debate. I don't really care. And maybe it's something that even the states could decide for themselves. And that is the sort of idea with all the other items on this list. Now, I mean, some of them are strictly federally funded items, like the military. However, other services listed, like education, electric services, internet services, these are all items where there is shared responsibility between federal, state, and local governments. One method of organization is the federal government funds those services so that the end users, citizens, and businesses don't have to pay providers for those services. They are paid for through our tax dollars. This would therefore allow all services to be provided and guaranteed to all of our people. Then, the state and local governments can decide if they want the workers providing those services to be government employees or contracted out to private corporations and small businesses. This is where the Overton window of discussion needs to be in this country. Politicians have neglected to write policies to guarantee Americans' share in the rising prosperity. Instead of us all doing better, vast wealth has been concentrated in the hands of the few. I started this video by discussing 8 common political lenses in the United States. We have tried conservatism through liberalism and have failed to maintain a thriving economic society. If we want to do that, we must switch our efforts to educating Americans about social democracy and our politicians fighting for social democratic policies. Also, one quick clarification. Throughout this video, when I say Americans and politicians should fight for something, I am not speaking of fighting in violent ways. What I am saying is in order to fight in a nonviolent, democratic way, that is through the use of rhetoric, the use of language to inform, persuade people of your beliefs. This video is my way of fighting fascism during this time. It's a small action, but if more people unify and rally behind a single specific message, that can lead to real change. The change I want to see is Social Security for all. If you haven't seen that video yet, please watch it later. It is my vision of what the flagship policy could be to improve lives. If you end up agreeing with it, share it. Get more people speaking about it and social democracy. During the next elections, we will need a large coalition of voters to defeat Trump or whoever is the Republican nominee, if not Trump. For those voters out there that want to maintain your label, that's fine. I don't care what you call yourself in any context. What I do care about is us organizing to elect better candidates in the next primary elections of 2026 so that we elect congressional representatives ready to rein in this unlawful fascist executive branch. And then afterwards, in 2028, we elect more representatives and a new president to sign into law the next round of New Deal legislation. For those still listening, thank you very much. If you like what you heard, please hit that like button, share this video. Let's get the next political movement organized around social democracy and the Social Security for All Act. If you believe you have a better message, then go on, make a video describing that and convince others of what you believe in. Meanwhile, I will continue to fight for social democracy until my death stops me. I hope you appreciate the information in this video. In the next Secular Lefty chat, which I hope will be sooner than the gap between this and my previous video, but we'll see what life throws at me. As stated, the next chat will focus on Medicare for all and healthcare in general. We will go into more detail of that pillar in the Social Security for All plan, and then later videos on the other 4 pillars after that. Well, this video has gone on long enough. Thank you again for watching, and take care.